So good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's conference with le Cercle des Langues. Tonight we will be discussing comparatives and superlatives, the formation and use for comparison. Tonight's conference is level A1 to A2. Please feel free to put your email addresses into the chat so that after this evening's conference, I may send you the PDF so that you may learn the grammar or the vocabulary that you found interesting. So tonight's conference will be for 25 minutes. For the last 5 minutes, we will have a question and answer session. So that means you can put your questions either into the chat or you can put your questions on a piece of paper. And after the 25 minutes, you are then more than welcome to discuss certain things from the conference or ask any questions or make any comments. So let's begin. Tonight's conference will have 4 parts. We are going to look at how do we form comparatives. The second part, we will look at how do we form superlatives in English. In our third part, we will look at comparatives. How do we use them when we are comparing different things? And in our fourth part, we will look at superlatives and how do we use this for comparison. So what are comparatives and superlatives? On the right, you can see that there is an example. We have cheap, cheaper, or cheapest. That in French is moins cher. So quelque chose qui est moins cher. Our comparative forms. We use a comparative adjective to express how two people or things are different. And generally, when you want to compare something in English, you will use a noun or what we call a subject plus a verb and then the comparative, or the adjective plus then the noun. So before we discover the comparative, just to give you an example, we can say she is lonelier, as you can see in the picture, than the noun. So we've got this entire sentence. It is the noun plus the verb plus the comparative adjective plus than or plus noun. I do apologize. I did not see that it was connected. So an example would be, she is lonelier, that is our comparative, than him or than the neighbor. So the comparative would be lonelier with the word than. But we will look at the structure a little bit later. So the first thing we have to understand is that to create a comparative, you start with the adjective in English. So to create the comparative, you will take the adjective. For example, we can use lonely, as we saw before. And to compare, we will add er or ier to the end of the adjective. And that is the general formula for how to create our comparative. But in certain cases, if an adjective has 2 or more syllables, lonely, amazing, intelligent, we add the word more in front to create the comparative form. For example, this hotel is more expensive than the last hotel we stayed at. Reading is more interesting than watching TV. As I said before, for our shorter adjectives, we just add er. For example, if an adjective has one syllable or two syllables with a y as the second syllable, we add er to create the comparative. For example, taking the bus is cheaper. Well, cheap is the adjective, so that means we just add an er. Then taking the car. This box is heavier than that one. So to summarize, we use more for longer syllable adjectives and we use er for shorter syllable adjectives. So your rule, add er to most one-syllable adjectives. For example, small becomes smaller. We use more for adjectives with two or more syllables. For example, beautiful, more beautiful. In general, we change the y to an I and we add er for two-syllable adjectives ending in y. Sometimes you have what we call irregular comparatives. As is often the case in English, there are some adjectives that are irregular and don't follow this rule. For example, we'll say good as an adjective, but we will not say good, gooder, goodest. It is an irregular adjective. That means that it will change completely. It will be good, which will become better as our comparative. So, for example, this meal is good, but the meal I had yesterday is better. Bad becomes worse, and far becomes further. Further is for your United Kingdom English, but it becomes farther for US English. So let's look at some examples with irregular comparatives. Your cooking is better than my cooking. Arriving late is worse than arriving early. So we also have another rule in English. Sometimes with our shorter adjectives, we need to double the final consonant. So we see the G is the final consonant. And then we add an ER. So you can see that when there is a CVC, a consonant, vowel, consonant, in most cases, we will double that last consonant and add our ER. Irregular adjectives have unique forms. That means we need to learn them off by heart. For example, good and better. Do not change comparative forms for two syllables or more ending in Y. So for example, interesting becomes more interesting. For less comparison, that means when you want to say that something is less. En français, on dit c'est moins. To use this in English, we will say that it is less plus an adjective. For example, it is less important. Okay, so this document is less important than that document or yesterday's document. Okay, and then we will use as and as for an equality comparison. Now, what does that mean? When you would like to say that two things are the same, you will use as with the comparison as. I will give you an example. John is as tall as his brother. So you will always put that adjective in between the two words as. Jenny is as small as her sister. It is a way to say that two things are equal. So now that we have covered the comparative form and how we create it, we are moving on to the superlative. So in your mind, you can imagine a table, and we start with our adjective, and our adjective creates our comparative, and our adjective can also then create what we know as the superlative form. We use a superlative adjective to show how one person or thing is different to all the others of its kind. And in this example, you have the noun or the subject of the sentence, plus the verb, plus the, with the superlative adjective, plus the noun object. So en français, vous dites que c'est la femme est la plus belle. La plus belle. So in English, we also use that la. The equivalent would be the. So let's have a look. The most for long adjectives. So as you saw with our comparatives, we used more. And now to show that it is the highest degree or that it is the lowest degree, we use the. Okay? If an adjective has two or more syllables, we add the most in front to create the superlative form. For example, she's the most determined candidate we have seen today. It's the most difficult part of my job. So it will always be the same. You will have the plus most, and then you will have that adjective to compare something or to say that it is the highest or the lowest form. And exactly as with the comparatives, you will add est for short adjectives. If an adjective has one syllable or two syllables with y on the end, we add est to create the superlative. For example, what's the longest flight you've ever taken? He's the nicest guy I've ever met. Here. So, with our rules for the superlative, we add est to most one-syllable adjectives. Small, smallest. Big, biggest. So we started with small as an adjective, smaller as a comparative, and smallest as a superlative. Then we use most for adjectives with two or more syllables. For example, beautiful is our adjective. It becomes most beautiful for our superlative. But for the comparative, it will be more beautiful. So we have beautiful, more beautiful, most beautiful. And then we change the Y to an I and add est for two-syllable adjectives ending in Y. For example, happy, happier, happiest. And there are always our irregular superlatives. Our irregular superlatives, they are the same adjectives that are irregular for comparatives, which are also irregular for the superlative forms. So for example, we had good, which was our adjective. It became better for our comparative, and it becomes best for the superlative. We have bad for our adjective, we have worse for our comparative, and we have worst for our superlative. We have far for our adjective, further for our comparative, and furthest for our superlative. Some examples of these irregular superlatives are: is this the best place to eat in town? Yesterday's performance was my worst ever. Another rule would, as we did with the comparative, is we double the final consonant for one syllable adjectives ending in a consonant vowel consonant. So big, biggest. And our irregular adjectives have unique forms. For example, good becomes best. Do not change the superlative forms for two or more syllables not ending in Y. For example, interesting, interesting. It stays longer, so we use more or most for the superlative. For less, we now use the word least before the adjective. So it is least important. It is less important, and that becomes least important. We use the and of to indicate the superlative within a group. For example, the tallest of all. That means he is the tallest compared to the group. So now that we have looked at our rules, let's look at how we use these comparisons, these comparatives and superlatives. Comparative adjectives enable us to express the difference between two people or things. In order to say that someone or something has a superior quality, size, or characteristic. For example, the sea here is more beautiful than the sea in my country. When you refer to two people or things you are comparing, you need to use than. For example, living in the city is better than living in the country. The word than helps us to put the two phrases together. But if it is clear what you are referring to, you don't need to use than. For example, living in the city is more expensive. So what does that mean? If you are having a conversation with someone and he says, "Oh, I love the city," I can say, "Yes, but living in the city is more expensive." If there is already this comparison, maybe between the city and the countryside, la campagna. If he says, "Oh my goodness, the countryside is beautiful, but I love the city," that's when you can say, living in the city is more expensive, because he already knows what you are speaking about. However, if you are starting a new conversation and you would like to make this comparison, it is a good idea to use than. The city is more expensive than the countryside. We use less to say that something has an inferior quality, size, or characteristic. And we put less in front of an adjective. For example, walking is less tiring than running. Australia is less populated than China. Et en français, on utilise moins. Using as and as is a structure used to express equality or similarity between two things with adjectives or adverbs. For example, he is as tall as his father. That means him and his father have the same size. They are the same height. Il est aussi grand que son père. How do we use our superlatives? We use superlatives to compare one person or thing to several others, but not in a comparison. We use it to say that it is the highest or the lowest. So Paris is the most beautiful city I've ever seen. As an example, you are saying that out of every city I have seen, Paris is the most beautiful. We use the superlative form of an adjective or an adverb to compare three or more things. For example, both John and his brother play football, but John is better. So now we are putting John at the highest point in the category. After the superlative, we use in before names of places or before singular words referring to groups of people, for example, class, school, team, family. For example, she is the best student in the class. He's the tallest in the family. We have the difference in French when we say il est le meilleur du monde. And du monde makes us think that we need to say of the world. But in English, we need to say in the class. In de la famille en français, mais en anglais, on dit in the family. So we just need to make those small changes in our minds for it to make sense in English. Before the superlative, we always use the, so the, or a possessive adjective. For example, my, your, his, or noun plus the possessive. For example, Paul's, Elizabeth's. For example, he is the best. This is my most expensive jacket. This is Paul's best friend. So to summarize, we use a comparative adjective to express how two people or things are different. We use a superlative adjective to show how one person or thing is different to all the others of its kind. It can be the highest or the upper limit or the lowest. For example, Mick is taller than Jack, but Mick is the tallest person in the family. Sometimes you have your one-syllable adjectives. For example, tall, which becomes taller and tallest. Fat, fatter, fattest. Big, bigger, biggest. Sad, sadder, saddest. Sometimes you have your two-syllable adjectives. Happy, happier, happiest. Simple, simpler, simplest. Busy, busier, busiest. Your three or more syllables are like important, more important, most important, expensive, more expensive, most expensive. And our irregular comparatives and superlatives: good, better, best; bad, worse, worst; little, less, least; much, more, most; far, further or farther; furthest or farthest. So thank you for watching this evening's conference. Do you have any questions or comments that you would like to make? And thank you, Jean, for such a beautiful compliment. I am here to help each and every one of you better understand the English language. So if you have any questions or comments, you are more than welcome to unmute your microphones now. Thank you. I didn't think that it was that complicated between irregular adjectives, what to add depending on the syllables, and before and after the adjective. Yes, so we really just need to understand it. But for the most part, the rule in general that we can use, Christelle, is that we can add, if you are unsure, it is better to add more or most, okay? And then it still has a sense, because it's better to say more slow than to go, oh, do I say slower, slowest? So that's a very bad example. But it's better to, when you are in doubt, to add more and most. Okay? So my absolute pleasure to everyone. And I will send everyone this conference via PDF after the conference. So please have a wonderful evening and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week. Goodbye, everyone.